Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of Phoenix, Arizona. Before we begin, I ask that you write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. In the summer of 1910, Phoenix was a city caught between two worlds. The desert heat pressed down on dirt roads that were slowly being paved over, and electric streetlights had begun to replace gas lamps along Washington Street. The population had swelled to over 11,000 souls, most of them drawn by promises of health, opportunity, and the relentless Arizona sun. It was a place where tubercular patients came to breathe easier, where citrus groves stretched toward distant mountains, and where a certain kind of person could disappear into the vastness of the Sonoran landscape without much notice. Among those who arrived that year was a man whose name would eventually be whispered with a mixture of fear and fascination, though the full truth of what he discovered would remain buried in medical archives and personal correspondence for decades. His name was Dr. Emmett Aldous Grayson, and he came to Phoenix with a leather trunk full of journals, a collection of unusual surgical instruments, and a theory that would consume the final months of his life. Grayson arrived on the Southern Pacific Railroad on the 14th of June, 1910. He was 43 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts unremarkable in appearance. Those who encountered him at the train station later described a man of average height, with prematurely grey hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and hands that trembled slightly when he was not actively using them. He wore a dark wool suit despite the heat, and he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned to move through the world without drawing attention. He rented a small adobe house on the eastern outskirts of the city, near the Salt River, in an area where properties were separated by acres of creosote and palo verde. The nearest neighbor, a widow named Constance Merrill, lived a quarter-mile down a rutted dirt road. She would later tell investigators that Dr. Grayson was polite but distant, that he kept his curtains drawn even during the day, and that she sometimes heard strange sounds coming from his property late at night. "What kind of sounds?" she was asked. She paused before answering. "Mechanical sounds," she said, "and sometimes something that might have been singing, though she could not be certain." Grayson had been trained at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, graduating in 1894 with honors in anatomy and physiology. For the next 16 years, he had worked at various hospitals and private clinics throughout the northeastern United States, building a reputation as a skilled but eccentric physician. His particular interest was in what was then called neurocardiology, the study of the relationship between the nervous system and the heart. This was not an unusual field of inquiry at the time. Many physicians believed that the heart was more than a simple pump, that it possessed its own intelligence, its own capacity to store memory and emotion. But Grayson took this idea further than most. According to correspondence preserved in the archives of the Maricopa County Medical Society, he believed that the human heart contained what he called a liminal chamber, a structure so small and so perfectly hidden within the cardiac tissue that conventional dissection could not reveal it. This chamber, he theorized, was the seat of the soul. More than that, he believed it was a doorway. He never specified where this doorway led, at least not in his published writings. But those who knew him during his final years in Baltimore reported that he had become increasingly obsessed with the idea that consciousness did not end with death, that it merely transferred through this hidden passage into what he called the substrate, a term he never fully defined. Why he left Baltimore for Phoenix remains a matter of speculation. Some believed he had been forced to resign from his position at Union Memorial Hospital following an incident involving unauthorized use of cadavers. Others suggested he had suffered a personal tragedy, the loss of a child or a spouse, though no records of such an event have been found. What is known is that by the time he arrived in Arizona, he had severed most of his professional ties and was living on a modest inheritance from his father, a textile merchant who had died 3 years earlier. He did not seek employment at any of Phoenix's hospitals. He did not open a private practice. Instead, he spent his days in the small laboratory he had constructed in the back room of his adobe house, conducting experiments that no medical institution would have sanctioned. He purchased cadavers. This much is documented. Between June and October of 1910, Grayson arranged for the delivery of at least 7 bodies, all of them obtained through questionable means. At the time, Arizona had no comprehensive regulations governing the disposition of the dead, and it was not uncommon for impoverished families to sell the remains of their relatives to medical schools or private researchers. Grayson paid in cash and asked no questions. The bodies were delivered at night, transported in plain wooden crates by a man named Luther Finch, who ran a freight business out of Tempe. Finch would later testify that Grayson always met him at the door with a lantern, that he never invited him inside, and that he paid double the agreed-upon price on the condition that Finch speak to no one about the deliveries. What Grayson did with those bodies would not become clear until much later. At the time, no one in Phoenix knew that the quiet doctor living on the edge of the desert was systematically dissecting human hearts in search of something that might not exist. No one knew that he was keeping detailed records of his findings, complete with anatomical drawings so precise they would later be compared to the work of Leonardo da Vinci. And no one knew that by late September he believed he had found what he was looking for. The first indication that something unusual was happening came from Dr. Benjamin Hale, a general practitioner who had met Grayson briefly at a medical supply store on First Avenue. Hale later recalled that Grayson had been purchasing formaldehyde in quantities that seemed excessive for a man conducting private research. When Hale asked what he was working on, Grayson had smiled and said, "I am looking for the place where the body ends and something else begins." Hale assumed he was speaking metaphorically, a philosophical musing on the nature of mortality. But the intensity in Grayson's eyes had stayed with him. He described it as the look of a man who had glimpsed something he should not have seen. On the 23rd of September, 1910, Grayson mailed a letter to Dr. Howard Wills, a former colleague at Johns Hopkins. The letter was discovered years later among Wills's personal papers, donated to the university library after his death in 1938. In it, Grayson described what he called the most significant discovery in the history of human anatomy. He wrote that he had identified a microscopic structure within the posterior wall of the left ventricle, a cluster of cells that did not behave like any other cardiac tissue. These cells, he claimed, did not contract or conduct electrical impulses. Instead, they vibrated at a frequency too subtle to be measured by contemporary instruments. He believed these vibrations were not random, that they formed a pattern, a kind of language. He wrote that he had been trying to decode this pattern for weeks, and that he was beginning to understand what it was saying. The letter was rambling, filled with technical jargon and cryptic references to ancient medical texts. Grayson mentioned the writings of Galen and Ibn Sina, physicians who had written about the heart as a vessel for divine essence. He quoted from the Sushruta Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit text that described the heart as containing chambers visible only to those who had achieved spiritual clarity. He wrote that these ancient physicians had known something that modern medicine had forgotten, that they had understood the heart not merely as an organ, but as an antenna, a receiver for signals emanating from a realm beyond physical sensation. The letter ended abruptly. Grayson wrote that he would send further details soon, but that he needed to conduct one final experiment to confirm his hypothesis. He signed his name and added a postscript. He wrote, "If you do not hear from me again, do not come looking. What I have found is not meant for the living." Dr. Wills never received another letter from Emmett Grayson. For 2 weeks, Grayson continued his work in isolation. Constance Merrill noted that the sounds from his property grew more frequent during this time, and that she sometimes saw lights burning in his windows well past midnight. On one occasion, she claimed to have seen Grayson standing in his yard, staring up at the sky, his arms outstretched as though he were waiting to receive something. She mentioned this to her daughter, who suggested that perhaps the doctor was simply eccentric, that city people often behaved strangely when they first arrived in the desert, but Constance was not convinced. She told her daughter that there was something wrong about the way he stood, something too still, too rigid, like a man who had forgotten how to move naturally. On the morning of October 7th, 1910, Constance Merrill walked to Grayson's property to deliver a basket of preserves her daughter had made. She had been meaning to bring them for days, but the heat had kept her indoors. When she arrived at the adobe house, she found the front door slightly ajar. She called out, but there was no response. The air smelled wrong, she later told investigators. Not like death, but like something burned and something sweet mixed together. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The front room was empty. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, as though no one had been there in weeks, but Grayson had been seen just 4 days earlier, purchasing supplies at a general store on Central Avenue. Constance walked through the house, calling his name. When she reached the back room, the one Grayson had converted into a laboratory, she stopped. The door was locked from the inside. She could hear a faint humming sound coming from within, a low vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. The humming continued, steady and unchanging, and beneath it, she thought she could hear something else, a voice perhaps, or the echo of a voice, speaking words she could not understand. She returned to her own home and sent her son to fetch the constable. By the time they arrived, it was late afternoon. Constable Raymond Howell was a practical man, not given to superstition, but he would later admit that he hesitated before forcing the door open. Something about the silence in that house felt deliberate, as though the building itself was holding its breath. When the door finally gave way, the humming stopped. They found Emmett Grayson seated at a wooden table in the center of the room. He was dead. His body showed no signs of violence, no wounds or trauma. He was slumped forward, his head resting on his folded arms, as though he had simply fallen asleep. On the table in front of him was an open journal, its pages covered in dense handwriting and intricate diagrams. Beside the journal was a glass jar filled with a pale fluid. Floating in the fluid was a human heart. It was later determined to be Grayson's own. The room itself was meticulously organized. Surgical instruments were arranged on a cloth beside the table, each one cleaned and placed with precision. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars containing tissue samples, all of them labeled with dates and notations in Grayson's handwriting. A blackboard stood in one corner, covered in equations and anatomical sketches. In the center of the board, written in large letters, was a single phrase: "The door opens inward." The implications of this discovery were immediate and deeply disturbing. A post-mortem examination, conducted by Dr. Martin Ashford at the county morgue, confirmed that Grayson's chest cavity had been opened with surgical precision. The incision was clean, the ribs spread and held in place with clamps that were still attached when the body was found. The pericardium had been carefully removed, and the heart had been excised in a manner consistent with someone who possessed advanced anatomical knowledge. The question that no one could answer was how Grayson had performed this operation on himself. The procedure would have required at least 15 to 20 minutes, even for a skilled surgeon working at peak efficiency. During that time, Grayson would have been conscious. He would have felt everything, and yet there was no indication that he had struggled or cried out. The room showed no signs of disturbance. The surgical instruments were arranged neatly on a cloth beside the table. There were no bloodstains on the floor, no evidence of panic. It was as though Grayson had approached his own death with the same clinical detachment he had brought to every other aspect of his work. Dr. Ashford noted several anomalies in his report. First, Grayson's heart, when examined, showed no signs of disease or abnormality. It was, by all measures, a healthy organ. Second, the manner in which it had been preserved suggested that Grayson had prepared the solution in advance, that he had known exactly how long he had to work before consciousness failed. Third, and most disturbing, the heart continued to exhibit faint electrical activity for nearly 6 hours after it was removed from the body. This was impossible. Cardiac tissue deprived of oxygenated blood should cease all activity within minutes, and yet Ashford recorded that when he placed electrodes on the tissue, he detected rhythmic pulses that did not correspond to any known cardiac function. He wrote in his notes that the pulses seemed to follow a pattern, a sequence that repeated every 11 seconds. He could not explain this phenomenon, and he chose not to include it in his official report, fearing that it would invite ridicule from the medical community. But he preserved his personal notes, and they were later discovered among his papers after his death in 1942. The journal found on Grayson's table was seized as evidence and later deposited in the archives of the Maricopa County Medical Society, where it remained largely unread for decades. The handwriting was difficult to decipher, a mixture of medical terminology, personal observations, and what appeared to be coded language. Those who attempted to study it reported that Grayson's entries became increasingly erratic in the final weeks of his life. He wrote about the liminal chamber with growing certainty, describing it as a structure that existed in what he called orthogonal space, a dimension that intersected with the physical heart but was not entirely contained within it. He claimed that he had found a way to stimulate this chamber through a combination of electrical current and precise chemical treatment. He wrote that when the vibrations reached a certain frequency, the chamber opened. He did not elaborate on what opening meant, but he noted that the experience was accompanied by a sensation he described as inversion, as though his perception had been turned inside out. He wrote that he could hear something on the other side of the chamber, a sound that was not quite sound, more like a resonance that bypassed the ears and struck directly into the mind. He wrote that the resonance was trying to communicate, that it had been waiting for someone to find it. In one entry, dated September 29th, Grayson described an experiment he had conducted on himself. He had constructed a device, a modified version of the electrocardiograph machines that were just beginning to appear in American hospitals. This device, however, was designed not to record electrical activity, but to generate it, to send controlled pulses directly into the cardiac tissue. Grayson wrote that he had attached electrodes to his own chest and delivered a series of carefully timed shocks. The sensation, he noted, was unlike anything he had experienced before. He described it as a pulling, as though something inside his chest was trying to move in a direction that did not exist in ordinary space. He wrote that he had seen flashes of light behind his closed eyelids, geometric patterns that shifted and reformed according to no logic he could discern, and he had heard the resonance, louder and clearer than ever before. It was not a voice, he insisted, but it carried meaning nonetheless. It told him that he was close, that he needed only to go a little further. He wrote, "I understand now that the chamber is not a structure in the conventional sense. It is a threshold, and thresholds must be crossed, not observed." On the final page of the journal, dated October 6, 1910, Grayson wrote, "Tomorrow I will go through. I have prepared everything. The chamber is open. I can feel it pulling at me even now, a gentle insistence that grows stronger each hour. I do not know what I will find on the other side, but I know that I cannot turn back. This is the culmination of everything I have worked toward. The answer to the question that has haunted me since I first held a human heart in my hands and felt the weight of something more than muscle and blood. If I am wrong, I will die. If I am right, death will be irrelevant. Below this entry was a single line, written in a different hand, more careful and deliberate. It is not God on the other side. It is what God fears. There was no indication of who had written this line or when it had been added. The handwriting did not match Grayson's. The ink appeared to be the same, but the pressure of the pen was lighter, as though the writer had been hesitant. Some believed that Grayson himself had written it in a moment of clarity or terror, that he had paused before carrying out his final experiment and acknowledged the possibility that he had been wrong. Others suggested that someone else had been in the room with him, an assistant or collaborator whose existence had never been documented. No evidence was ever found to support either theory. The investigation into Grayson's death was brief and inconclusive. The official cause of death was listed as exsanguination, resulting from self-inflicted surgical trauma. The case was classified as a suicide, though many who reviewed the evidence privately expressed doubts. A man does not calmly remove his own heart without some form of compulsion, something beyond ordinary despair. But what that compulsion might have been, no one could say. Constable Howell, in an interview conducted years later, admitted that the case had troubled him more than any other he had worked during his career. He said that there was something about the scene that felt staged, as though Grayson had been following a script written by someone else. He mentioned the cleanliness of the laboratory, the precision with which everything had been arranged. He said that in his experience, people who took their own lives rarely displayed such meticulous attention to detail. They acted out of impulse, out of anguish. But Grayson had been methodical. He had known exactly what he was doing, and he had done it without hesitation. The house on the edge of the desert was sold to a family from Ohio who knew nothing of its history. They lived there for 3 years before moving away. They never spoke publicly about their reasons for leaving, but a letter written by the wife, Margaret Hollins, to her sister in Cleveland mentioned that the house felt wrong. She wrote that her youngest daughter refused to sleep in the back room, that she complained of a sound like humming that no one else could hear. She wrote that one night she had woken to find her husband standing at the window, staring out at the desert, his lips moving as though he were speaking to someone. When she asked him what he was doing, he did not respond. He did not even seem to hear her. She had to shake him twice before he turned around, and when he did, his eyes were empty. He told her later that he did not remember any of it. Margaret also wrote about finding marks on the walls of the back room, faint scratches that formed patterns she could not interpret. She had tried to scrub them away, but they seemed to reappear no matter how many times she cleaned. Her husband dismissed it as water stains or tricks of the light, but Margaret was not convinced. She wrote that sometimes when she stood in that room alone, she felt as though she were being measured, as though something unseen was studying her with cold, clinical interest. The house was sold again in 1916, this time to a doctor who planned to use it as a private clinic. He lasted less than a month. He told the real estate agent that he had found something in the back room, something that had been sealed behind a wall. He would not say what it was, only that he had burned it and that he would not return under any circumstances. The agent asked if the house was unsafe. The doctor shook his head. He said, "It is not the house. It is what was invited in." After that, the property remained vacant for years. The adobe walls began to crumble. The roof caved in during a rare monsoon storm in 1922. By 1930, the structure was little more than a ruin, a pile of sun-bleached brick and rotting wood that local children were warned to avoid. Parents told stories about the mad doctor who had lived there, stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some said he had been trying to bring the dead back to life. Others said he had been searching for a way to communicate with demons. The truth, buried in medical archives and forgotten journals, was stranger than any of the stories. The land was eventually purchased by the city and paved over during the expansion of East Van Buren Street. Today, there is no marker, no indication that anything of significance ever stood there, but the story of Dr. Emmett Aldous Grayson did not end with the demolition of his house. In 1947, a graduate student at the University of Arizona, conducting research on early medical practices in the state, came across Grayson's journal in the archives. His name was Peter Calloway, and he was writing a dissertation on the history of cardiology in the American Southwest. He requested permission to photocopy the journal, which was granted. He spent 3 months transcribing the text, cross-referencing Grayson's anatomical descriptions with contemporary medical knowledge. What he found unsettled him. Grayson's descriptions of the liminal chamber corresponded, at least in part, to a structure that had only recently been identified by modern cardiologists, the sinoatrial node, a cluster of specialized cells responsible for regulating the heart's rhythm, but the sinoatrial node was located in the right atrium, not the posterior wall of the left ventricle, as Grayson had claimed. More confusing was Grayson's assertion that the chamber vibrated at a frequency beyond measurement. Modern instruments had detected no such vibrations. Calloway wrote to several leading cardiologists asking if they had ever encountered similar findings. Most dismissed the inquiry as nonsense, the delusions of a man who had clearly suffered from some form of mental illness. But one doctor, a researcher at the Mayo Clinic named Thomas Renwick, responded with interest. He wrote that he had encountered similar claims in unpublished medical literature from the late 19th century, particularly among European physicians who had experimented with electrical stimulation of the heart. These doctors had reported anomalous results, sensations of presence, auditory hallucinations, and in one case a subject who claimed to have seen through the eyes of God. Renwick noted that all of these experiments had been discontinued after several subjects died under mysterious circumstances. The official explanation was cardiac arrest brought on by excessive electrical stimulation, but Renwick had found private correspondence suggesting that some of the researchers believed they had triggered something else, something that should not have been awakened. One letter, written by a German physiologist named Ernst Fleischer, described a patient who had undergone experimental cardiac treatment in 1897. After the procedure, the patient had become catatonic, staring straight ahead and refusing to speak. When he finally did speak, 3 days later, he said only one thing: "I went through the door in my chest, and I saw the place where we go when the world forgets us." Calloway continued his research. He traveled to Baltimore, where he gained access to the archives of Union Memorial Hospital. There, he found records indicating that Grayson had been involved in an incident in 1909, 1 year before his arrival in Phoenix. A patient under his care, a woman named Lillian Eckhart, had undergone a routine cardiac examination. During the procedure, Grayson had administered an electrical current to her chest, ostensibly to measure her heart's response. The woman had convulsed violently and lost consciousness. When she awoke, she was screaming. She told the nurses that she had been somewhere else, that she had seen a place without light or sound, a void that was aware of her. She said that something in that void had spoken to her, not with words, but with a feeling that pressed into her mind like a weight. She could not describe what it had said, only that she knew she was not meant to hear it. Lillian Eckhart was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. She died by her own hand 2 weeks after that. The hospital conducted an internal investigation, but no formal charges were brought against Grayson. He resigned shortly thereafter. In a letter to a colleague, Grayson wrote that he had been conducting legitimate research, that Lillian's reaction had been unexpected, but not entirely surprising. He wrote, "She went further than I intended. She crossed a threshold I did not know existed. But what she found there, I cannot say." She would not speak of it, except to say that it was waiting. Calloway included a brief mention of Grayson's work in his dissertation, but he did not elaborate on the more disturbing aspects of the case. He later told a colleague that he had decided to omit certain details because he did not want to give credence to what he called medical superstition. But in a personal letter written in 1951, Calloway admitted that his research had left him with lingering questions. He wrote, "I do not know what Grayson found, or if he found anything at all, but I do know that the human heart is not as well understood as we pretend. There are structures within it that serve no clear purpose, rhythms that do not correspond to any physiological need. It is possible that Grayson was simply mad, that he saw patterns where none existed, but it is also possible that he was looking in a direction the rest of us have been too afraid to face." Calloway died in 1963. His notes and correspondence were donated to the University of Arizona Library, where they remain accessible to researchers. Few have bothered to examine them. The prevailing attitude in the medical community is that Grayson's work represents a fascinating but ultimately misguided chapter in the history of cardiac research, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the limits of human understanding. In 1958, a Phoenix architect named Donald Kirby was hired to design a medical office building on East Van Buren Street, on the site where Grayson's house had once stood. During the excavation, workers uncovered the remains of the original foundation. Beneath the foundation, they found a small cellar that had not been documented in any of the original property records. The cellar was empty except for a rusted metal box. Inside the box were glass slides, the kind used in microscopy, each one carefully labeled with a date and a set of initials. The slides contained tissue samples, all of them cardiac muscle. Kirby sent the slides to a pathologist who examined them under a microscope. He reported that the tissue was remarkably well preserved, despite being nearly 50 years old. More puzzling was the presence of an unknown cellular structure within the samples, a cluster of cells that did not match any known type of cardiac tissue. The pathologist wrote that the cells appeared to be arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a circuit. He noted that when he applied a mild electrical current to one of the slides, the cells emitted a faint luminescence, a glow that lasted for several seconds before fading. He could not explain this phenomenon. He suggested that the samples be sent to a research institution for further study. They never were. Kirby decided that the discovery was too strange, too likely to attract unwanted attention. He instructed the workers to rebury the box and continue with the construction. The medical office building was completed in 1959. It operated without incident for decades. But there were rumors. Employees who worked in the building reported feeling uneasy in certain rooms, particularly those on the ground floor, directly above where the cellar had been. They described a sensation of being watched, of hearing faint sounds that had no identifiable source. One receptionist quit after 3 months, claiming that she had seen a figure standing in the corner of the waiting room late one evening. When she turned on the lights, the figure was gone. She described it as a man in dark clothing, standing perfectly still, with his hand pressed to his chest. A janitor reported finding doors that he had locked standing open in the morning, and once he found a set of surgical instruments arranged on a desk in a pattern he could not explain. When asked to describe the pattern, he said it looked like something anatomical, like a diagram of something inside the body. He had thrown the instruments away and refused to work alone in the building after that. The building changed hands several times. In 1992, It was converted into a storage facility. In 2006, it was demolished to make way for a parking structure. No further anomalies were reported, though some who had worked in the building over the years continued to speak of it with a certain discomfort. They said there was something about the place that felt off, as though the ground itself remembered what had been done there. One former employee, interviewed in 2008 for a local history project, said that she had sometimes felt a vibration coming through the floor, a subtle pulse that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. She said it was probably just the building's HVAC system, but she never quite convinced herself of that explanation. She said that on her last day of work, she had stood in the room where she had felt the vibration most strongly and closed her eyes. For just a moment, she said, she had the distinct impression that she was standing on the edge of something vast and empty, a space that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the room. Then the feeling passed, and she left and never went back. The story of Dr. Emmett Aldous Grayson might have faded entirely into obscurity, a footnote in the medical history of Arizona, were it not for a single document that surfaced in 2014. A collector of medical antiques, browsing an estate sale in Scottsdale, purchased a box of old medical texts and journals. Among them was a small leather-bound notebook with no markings on the cover. Inside, written in a careful hand, was a series of entries dated between September and October of 1910. The handwriting matched Grayson's. The notebook appeared to be a personal diary, distinct from the journal found on his laboratory table. The entries were brief, almost cryptic. On September 28th, he wrote, "The chamber does not open into space, it opens into time, or perhaps into something that time passes through, but does not touch. On October 1st, I have begun to hear it, even when I am not working. It calls to me in the silence between heartbeats. I have tried to ignore it, but it grows louder each day. It is patient. It knows I will answer." On October 2nd, I conducted another experiment on myself tonight. I increased the voltage beyond safe limits. The pain was extraordinary, but it lasted only a moment, and in that moment, I saw. I cannot describe what I saw, because it was not a visual experience. It was more like understanding, a sudden and complete knowledge of something I had never considered before. I understood that the heart is not the center of life. It is the gateway to what comes after. On October 4th, I understand now why this was hidden. It is not for protection of the discoverer. It is for protection of what lies beyond. There are things that should not be disturbed, doorways that should remain closed, but I have come too far to turn back. I must know. I must see for myself what lies on the other side. If I am destroyed in the process, so be it. Some knowledge is worth any price. On October 5th, I have made my decision. Tomorrow night I will perform the final procedure. I have calculated everything, prepared every contingency. The heart must be removed while I am still conscious, while the liminal chamber is still open. Only then will I be able to pass through completely. I do not expect to survive in any conventional sense. But survival is not the point. The point is to know. The point is to see what no one else has seen. The final entry was dated October 6th, the night before Grayson's death. It consisted of a single sentence: "I am going to meet what I have been running from my entire life." The notebook was donated to the Arizona Historical Society, where it was catalogued and filed. No research has been conducted on its contents. There are no plans to do so. The official position of the medical community, both then and now, is that Emmett Aldous Grayson was a brilliant but troubled man who succumbed to delusion and self-destruction. His theories about the liminal chamber are considered pseudoscience, a product of an era when the boundaries between medicine and mysticism were less clearly defined. But there are those who wonder, There are those who look at the gaps in the historical record, the unanswered questions, the strange occurrences that clustered around the places Grayson lived and worked, and they ask themselves if it is possible that he found something real, not God perhaps, but something that exists in the hidden architecture of the human body, waiting to be discovered by someone foolish enough or desperate enough to look. Some have pointed to recent advances in cardiac research, studies that have identified previously unknown types of cells within the heart, structures that do not fit neatly into existing models of cardiac function. Some have noted that certain patients who undergo cardiac surgery report unusual experiences, sensations of being outside their bodies, memories that do not belong to them, glimpses of places they have never been. These experiences are typically attributed to anesthesia, to oxygen deprivation, to the stress of surgery. But what if they are something more? What if the heart truly is a doorway? And what if modern medicine, with its sophisticated tools and precise techniques, is beginning to open that door without realizing it? The desert outside Phoenix has not changed much since 1910. The city has grown, sprawling outward in all directions, but there are still places where the land remains as it was, vast and empty and silent. On certain nights, when the wind is still and the temperature drops, people walking alone on the outskirts of the city report hearing a sound that seems to come from beneath the ground. It is a low hum, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat amplified and distorted. Most dismiss it as the hum of distant machinery, the vibrations of underground pipes or electrical lines, but some who have heard it say that it feels different. They say it feels like the earth itself is breathing. They say it feels like something is listening. And if you stand in the right place at the right time, and you close your eyes and press your hand to your chest, you might feel it too. A faint vibration, too subtle to measure, too persistent to ignore. The echo of a door that was opened and never fully closed. A doorway that leads not to heaven or hell, but to something in between. Something that has been waiting in the silence of our own bodies since the first human heart began to beat. And perhaps, in the end, that is what Emmett Grayson discovered. Not the location of the soul, but the understanding that we carry our own thresholds within us, that every heartbeat is an opportunity to cross over into something unknown. He simply had the courage, or the madness, to step through.